Here is Sailor Studio 935, a purple ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. This purple in the swatch shows a gold sheen, but I really didn't get any in the writing sample. I will say that the notes that I'm currently taking are on the old Tomaway River paper, and I do see the sheen there. So, outstanding. This does have some tone shift as you change pen and paper, but if they aren't side by side, you probably really won't see the difference, and this is a fairly consistent shader. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it loses most of its shading, but it stays an interesting purple. Now, I like purple a lot, and I liked using this a lot, and really think that the Medici might have been a great choice for this to be in. The pen for today is a Visconti Medici oversize with a broad nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Here we have a beautiful dark and much darker purple through all of the writing, really a fantastic tone. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. If you take a look at Valley on the first line, the VA are darker than the LL, but the EY at the end does get quite a bit darker again. Throated, also on the first line, has a light T, nice mid-tone R, or H, darker R, light at the OA, T, the ED at the end do darken a bit. Now I'm starting to wonder if perhaps some of what's going to show as shading is the aspect that causes the sheen. Why shimmer? No shimmer here. The sheen. I think some of the shading of what I'm seeing is a result of what's in the ink that causes sheen. Looking at the back of the page, there's a spot or two that it did get deeper into the paper. Really surprising considering this is a Sailor ink. Other than that, we have no bleeding, nothing, this didn't touch the page underneath. And for the most part, no ghosting. Only those couple of spots where it got a little deeper. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Sailor Illinois. Here is Sailor Maryland. Here is Sailor New York. Here is Sailor Pennsylvania. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. We get a very dark purple on the page, more dark than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. I'm going to take that back. It does feather a little bit. I'm seeing it in wielding. I'm seeing it on beside on the fourth line that you are not to yet. It doesn't spread though. It does shade. You can see it quite a bit, even with as dark as it really is coming here. Take a look at upon on the second line, where the U and most of the P is a nice dark tone, but the bottom of the P is a very dark. Lightens a little bit into the O, but the N at the end, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, you see this ink did get deep into the paper, making me, at first thinking maybe the Clairfontaine paper I had aged out, but seeing it here really makes me feel like this might be a little bit more of an aggressive ink, perhaps again tied to that element that causes the ink to sheen. Now, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath, but I probably would not write on the back of the page. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Here we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It is completely unaffected by there being toned paper, showing this is really opaque as an ink. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. I'm seeing nothing for shading. It's just a beautiful, very dark purple that looks good. Once again, we can see a spot that the ink got very deep into the paper, or two spots, but it didn't bleed through touching the page underneath. It just shows I'm coming to that aspect that gives it sheen is an aggressive element in this ink. Otherwise, I would say the ghosting is nothing you could write on the back of the page. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page. and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. We have the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade a little bit when you take a look at elves on the first line, where most of the word is a nice darker tone, but the S at the end does become much darker. Renewed underneath that, the RE is lighter in tone than the new or NE, but the W lightens up again, and the ED at the end, quite a bit darker. I think this is some of the nicest shading we've been seeing with this ink. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see a few spots where this really did get deeper into the paper. A common theme going on with this ink, that aspect giving it sheen, I think, is rather aggressive. It didn't bleed through touching the page underneath. You could write back here, but you need to be aware of this because if you were using a gusher of a pen and putting a lot of ink down, it might cause a problem for you. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Sailor Studio 653. Here is Sailor Studio 723. Here is Sailor Studio 752. Here is Sailor Studio 950. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Here we have a lighter, flatter tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, and I'm gonna say it's doing pretty good at it. Take a look at Trap on the first line, where mostly just a dark purple, but that P at the end does become quite a bit darker. Wolves on the second line, same thing, mostly a dark, but the ES at the end, very dark. But turning on the second line, the T is lighter than the UR. The NIN does lighten a little bit, and that G at the end, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, we found the paper that can defeat the aggressiveness of this ink. There's no bleeding, no ghosting, and you can easily continue your notes back here. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page. Here is Sailor Studio 760. Here is Mont Blanc Oyster Gray. Here is Thornton's Pink. Here is Pilot Mixable Yellow. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. We get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Not bad. I was really expecting more of a degrade on this. Now it does feather and it does spread. Both of those I think are under control, meaning it shouldn't stop you from using this ink on this paper. Just know that you're not going to get some of the same beauty. It's just as dark. It's just not as, let's say, stand out and wow as a color, but it's very nice there. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, we see that it is deeper into the paper. It did not bleed through touching the page underneath, but I do not think you could continue your notes back here, or you might lose all of your notes. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The Visconti Medici's Wet Broad really held a nice dark purple through the papers, though it did change a little bit with the papers. Now off camera, I went for a wet fine nib. It was just as dark, shaded the same, and then went to a dry fine, and there it did lighten up a little bit, and it even shaded a bit more. But I love this darker tone, so I will go for a wet pen of any nib size, and the sheen is coming through on this Tomoe River paper that I used for the notes, even though what you're currently seeing is the yellow Rhodia. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.